Hi, welcome to Deep End. My name doesn't matter. Let's dive in. So today we want to talk about David Brainerd. David Brainerd was a missionary in the early 1700s. He was born in 1718. He dies at 29 years old in 1747. Now, David Brainerd was born in the Americas. He was a American missionary. He was born in Massachusetts. Hammond, Massachusetts, and he was orphaned at age 15. He was born into a Puritan family, and at age 15, his parents die and leave him the family farm and land to farm and take care of. Now, he does that until he's 21 years old, and at 21, he becomes a believer in Christ Jesus, listening to Jonathan Edwards' sermons. He's sitting under Edwards as a pastor, and he becomes a Christian. After his conversion, he attends Yale for a few years before he is expelled, basically because he's too intense. So Brainerd had this personality that was just so consumed with the gospel and with grace of Jesus Christ that he was constantly arguing with his professors and pushing them to grace of Jesus all the time. So much so that he's in an argument with one of his professors at one point, and he looks at the professor and he says, "You have no more grace than an armchair." And the professor, that comment gets him expelled from Yale. Now, he continues to express missionary zeal and to impress those who are around him with his zealousness for the gospel. And in 1742, he is commissioned to preach. He's given a license and ordained to preach and commissioned to do so among the Indians. So he goes out to the Indian tribes and he begins to preach. Now, right before he leaves, he takes his inheritance, the farm and everything, and he gives it to a friend so that he could pay for his friend's education. And when he does that, he surrenders all that he owns, everything he owns except the clothes on his back and enough money and provisions to kind of start a new life with the tribe, and he goes to live with the tribe. He becomes a model for what we would understand as modern missions later of really adopting the culture that he goes into to minister to. Following the advice of Paul, I have become all things to all people in 1 Corinthians 9:22. David Brainerd really exemplifies this for us, showing us that when you go into a culture, you don't force that culture to become you. You learn to become part of that culture and bring the gospel redemption message into the culture that you're going into. Now, it's a long work. He stays with the Indians for 4 years, but he works very tirelessly, and he doesn't see fruit until near the end of his time there. There were next to no converts and nobody turning to come to Christ, and a lot of Indians just kind of rejecting him and kind of putting him off. He lived among the tribes. He lived in a wigwam and wore Indian clothes and learned Indian language and spoke to them and worked among them. So 4 years into his ministry, he takes a preaching journey down the Susquehanna River, and he had already contracted tuberculosis at some point. And so as he's traveling down this river, it gets worse and worse and worse. And as he's preaching, it finally catches up with him, and he goes back to Jonathan Edwards' house, who served as a mentor to him. And he goes back to Jonathan Edwards' house, and he stays in Jonathan Edwards' house, basically bedridden for a year, where he is nursed by Jonathan Edwards' daughter, and he falls in love with her, but they never get to marry because he passes away in 1747 after spending a year being cared for in Jonathan Edwards' home. So after he dies, Edwards then publishes Brainerd's diary, and that diary is pretty much what we know about David Brainerd. At 29 years old, Jonathan Edwards takes the man's diary after he's passed 29 years, and he publishes that diary so that everybody would know what a godly man this man was. And basically everything we know about David Brainerd, or most of what we know about David Brainerd, comes from Jonathan Edwards. And so this model of modern missionary tact is shown to us and revealed to us in a diary that he kept as in the 4 years that he was doing missions to the Indians. Now, this is just a side note, but if you are a believer in Christ, listen, write stuff down. Write the things down that you know, because you can have an impact beyond your death. We would not know anything about David Brainerd. He probably had about 77 converts total among the Indians, maybe 100 converts total among the Indians who became believers. He didn't start massive churches. He didn't start major missions movements. But after he died, his diary was published, and that diary even goes on to encourage men like William Carey on how to do missions. And we still read David Brainerd's diary today and the work of Jonathan Edwards about David Brainerd for the purpose of understanding how we are to do ministry. So write stuff down so that future generations could see what it means to be devoted to Christ. If you are a Christ follower who is obeying the Lord and walking in faith and trying your best to know Him and follow hard after Him, write so that you would be able to encourage future generations, or at least, I don't know, today's world, I don't know, make TikToks. I don't know. Do something that would continue your legacy after you are gone, or when you are no longer able to speak, or when you are no longer able to be present. So 29 years of life. David Brainerd gives everything he owns, everything, including his own life, to make a difference in the kingdom. What an inspiring truth for us. And isn't this the way that we should all be? That we should surrender all of our worldly possessions and all of our worldly goods and even our life to the point of giving the gospel to those who need it and those who don't know the truth. The length of time the Lord gives is not, it does not impact the measure of your impact on the gospel, on the kingdom. So David Brainerd was only given 29 years of life. Indeed, he was really only given 8 years of life because he didn't become a Christian until he was 21. And so he was really only given these 8 years of spiritual life, and he used all 8 up for the kingdom and did more work than many of us would imagine doing in a lifetime. So I hope that inspires you and encourages you to give all for the gospel and to stand up for Christ and to be missionaries in your own sphere where you are, because indeed that is what we are called to do, to become all things to all people, that we might save some. So thanks for joining me in Deep End. That was David Brainerd. Tomorrow we'll look at William Carey. Now go get to work.